Pokemon routes connect every single town there is in every single main series Pokemon game, and they're kind of boring, or well, they used to be. Well, some of them still are, and well, it's complicated. You see, in the first ever Pokemon game, you travel through a region called Kanto. Kanto has some really cool places to see and visit, and most of those are towns in which you can collect gym badges. And once you've collected 8 of those bad boys, you can then enter the Pokemon League. Well, if it was only that simple, and it's not, because if it was, we wouldn't have a Pokemon game. Of course, now we need to build paths in between all of these key areas in the game, and of course, create a location to put the actual Pokemon in. Back in the day though, these paths, or routes as we should call them, or routes, I don't really care, but these routes were kind of uninspiring to say the least. The real star of the show in these routes were the actual Pokemon you could collect and the trainers you can fight, not the copy and pasted pixel art making each route harder to identify than the last. However, as the franchise and technology evolved, it gave Gamefreak more room to put more attention and detail into each one of these routes and give them more character. Instead of, just copy and pasting the previous route and then just sort of jumbling some stuff around. Fast forward almost 30 years, and now we have over 200 of these things, and let's just say some of them are more forgettable than others. Which brings us to the topic of this video. Just what are the most forgettable Pokemon routes in the whole series? Now, I'm not just talking about the most boring or annoying Pokemon routes in the franchise, because in a way, those actually make the routes and the journey upon them memorable. I'm talking about the routes that pretty much no one will remember, either because they're not exciting enough to be memorable in a good way, but they're also not infuriating or annoying to the point where you do ironically remember them and how horrible they were to go across. If that was the case, this whole list would just be full of routes from Kanto. I'm sorry, Gen 1ers. Well, I'm actually really not. These routes are the ones so unremarkable, this very video is probably the only time you will ever hear anyone talking about them. Up first, we're going to venture all the way into Gen 6 and visit Kalos. On its own, unfortunately, Kalos has been highly criticized as being a region that may be fun in some areas, but in terms of routes and the whole map and world of the game is a bit lackluster. There are even specific areas in the game that seems like Game Freak wanted to develop, but maybe just simply didn't have enough time to do so. And I can't really blame them, because in Gen 6 and Kalos, they had to create 3D models of every single Pokemon, which I did appreciate, but it obviously gave them a bit less time to create the region, and so people criticize it a lot. A smaller regional dex and forgotten legendary lore definitely didn't help this game's case. But today we're going to be specifically looking at Route 9. Route 9 is a bit different, because unlike earlier when I said routes connect towns to towns, this route actually connects a town to a cave. Glittering Cave, that is. And Glittering Cave itself is pretty small and unrememberable, but we're not going to talk about that. At least not in this video. Route 9 is also pretty small and uses one of X and Y's new and strange and very limited mechanics, riding Pokemon. Now that we have other means of transport on Pokemon like in Sun and Moon or in Legends Arceus with Weirdir, for example, it seems like riding Pokemon in these games in Gen 6 were definitely some sort of test demo, and the whole system just felt a bit empty. They were slow, they didn't really add much to the gameplay, and were sort of just seen as a necessity rather than an option. Also, some of the riding Pokemon scales made no sense, like why is a little girl the size of a mammoth? In this particular route though, you had to ride on the Pokemon Rhyhorn to traverse the rocky terrain, and it was pretty slow. It was probably a bit interesting at the time, but as the franchise has moved on, this route and this traversing of the route has definitely become more forgettable. But this riding mechanic actually wasn't the only new mechanic Gen 6 introduced that was featured on Route 9, as Route 9 also contained the infamous Sky Battles. Sky Battles are pretty much what they say on the tin. They're just regular battles, but they do require a flying type Pokemon to take part in them, although you couldn't use the Gen 6 new Halucha. The flying type Pokemon. I guess because its 3D model wasn't flying, but that just begs the question, why not? This mechanic and Pokemon were introduced in the very same game. Also, my boy Gengar can't participate, but Carnivine can, because that makes sense. Anyway, Sky Battles have definitely been forgotten because they definitely just felt more limiting rather than intuitive. Unlike other unique battle styles that we have now, or have received in the past, like rotation battles and inverse battles. The thing with this specific Sky Battle though, is that it's the only battle battle on the entire route, and most of you probably didn't even know that because you skipped it. Because if you do not have a flying type Pokemon on your team, you'll just never know about this battle because the trainer won't stop you. It's kind of awkward. They're probably just waiting for someone with a flying type Pokemon that isn't Hawlucha. On top of this, you can only find 3 Pokemon in the wild on Route 9, those being Hippopotas, Sandile, and Heliolisk or Helioptile. I can't remember which one's the small one. That's how forgettable they are. His type, design, and move pool, how viable this Pokemon is competitively, which is not a lot, definitely makes it more forgettable than others. He does have a signature move, but it's also pretty useless and forgettable. Moving on, we're going to go back to where we said it all started, Kanto. Like I said before, the routes in Kanto aren't that inspiring, but what the hell is this? Well, I'll tell you, it's Route 7. Route 7 is a part of 4 routes all connecting to Saffron City, and the other 3 are kind of just okay, but this one definitely stands out. You just can't really excuse this route in any way possible. It just makes you question what happened here. There's so little space, and most of that space is literally that, space, just nothingness. I counted a total of 36 grass tiles in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but the rest of the route is completely empty, apart from the underground tunnel entrance. This whole route just sort of reminds me of Pluto, where different people argue if it is big enough to be counted as a planet. Like, is this even big enough to be counted as a Pokemon route? And in Gen 1, you won't even find any Pokemon exclusive to this route. So the grass tiles that there are, all 36 of them, you could argue are pretty useless. At least not until Gen 2. Gen 2 introduced 100 Pokemon. But some of these brand new Pokemon were locked away in the post-game, as that's the only way you could visit Kanto, which is weird because if these Pokemon are in Kanto, why weren't they in 1st Gen? Anyway, 2 of these Pokemon that were introduced in Gen 2 but are exclusive to the Gen 1 region for whatever reason are Murkrow and Houndour. The problem here is that the route is so small and seems so inconvenient, players probably won't be searching for Pokemon in the grass that long and will probably skip over these exclusive encounters anyway. Oh, and that's if you visit the route at night. For Houndour's case at least, you will not find him in the daytime. And remember, this is if the player decides to carry on after the credits roll. Most casual players don't. Meaning these 2 Pokemon at the time were definitely forgettable, not just because of how obscure they are, but how hard they were to obtain. Oh, and there's just no trainers here, unless you count Let's Go when there are 4, but 2 of those are also only available to battle in the postgame. So this route is just empty, and any sort of substance it does have is extremely difficult and awkward to find, and most of it's just locked behind postgame, no matter what game you're playing on. Next, we'll be traveling to Hoenn, aka Too Much Water. And we're going to get to water later because we're going to be looking at Route 106. You're probably very familiar with Route 106. It's the route north of Dewford Town. It's a very coastal and beachy area. It's also home to Granite Cave, which is much more substantial. But the Route 106 as you know it actually is only half the route. You see, the other half of this route you will discover after you get Surf, but probably way after that, as you have way more to do as soon as you get that HM. For now, you've probably and only known Route 106 as the sandy area of Route 106. And when you're limited to just the land side of the route, there's really not much going on here. The route is completely indistinguishable from the other coastal routes in the game and its next door neighbor Dewford Town. The wild Pokemon available are also wild Pokemon that you will have seen so many times at this point in the water, and there's only 2 trainers here, Douglas and Nicole, and both of which aren't really worth fighting. And I know it's memed upon like I mentioned, but Hoenn really is just full of water. And by the time you visit the water side of Route 106, you've done your fair share of surfing, even used dive in some routes. And the water side of this route is pretty boring, but the same can't be said for others. In other water routes in the same game, there is much more to explore. Items, trainers, diving exclusive Pokemon, even some towns built on the water that just look so cool. The routes east and north of Route 106 contain much more interesting stuff like the abandoned ship and legendary Pokemon respectively. Yes, you heard that right, you will literally find the Pokemon Regice and Regigigas just north of Route 106. I just feel so sorry for it. And that Route 105 where you can obtain these legendary Pokemon can be approached from the north, meaning not only is there very little to explore in Route 106, but there's literally never any reason in-game to go to it. However, in Pokemon Emerald, there is one change to this route that completely turns the table. It has completely changed my mind in this route, and I almost didn't want to put it in the list because this change changes everything. You see this rock over here? Well, in Pokemon Emerald, that rock moves down 1 tile. This is fascinating stuff. In the next generation, we'll find ourselves in Sinnoh, and to be honest, I love this region. This region always felt so much more richer in lore, and it's where Game Freak really started to give each and every route a bit more character and uniqueness. That being said, I don't think I can say the same thing for Route 219. Route 219 is quite similar to the previous route we've just talked about, because at first it just seems like another coastal area containing Sand Gem Beach. There may be a lot of sand here, but not many gems. You will, however, find an antidote and super potion in Diamond and Pearl, but you can also find them just a couple tiles up in the Pokemart. Once you do find the HM Surf, you will be able to explore the route in its entirety. Well, there's really nothing of note here. However, unlike the previous route we just talked about, there is technically a reason to go here, and that is to visit Sinnoh's Pal Park. You know, the system where you can trade Pokemon from older generations up to Gen 4. The problem here is that there is another route leading to Pal Park. It's the route directly after 219, and it is way more interesting and full of new Pokemon and trainers. And it just makes you wonder why they didn't combine this route with 219. If they merged these two routes together, no one would ever know the difference. There are two trainers here, however. They are one battle, as they are a double battle. And they are kids, so I have to ask where their parents are. The next route on this list can be found in Sword and Shield's region, Galar. This whole region felt so much more richer than the previous ones. It was clear by now that Game Freak cared way more about making every route even more special than they did in Gen 4. Every route aside from Route 7, that is. Yes, you heard me correctly. There are 2 Route 7s on this list. I'm not really sure what happened with this route. This one's a little different, because not only has it been forgotten by the fans, but Game Freak themselves. Route 7 sits between Hammerlock Town and, well, we'll get to the other location later. The main problem and issue I have with this route is that it seems like it was handpicked directly from Kanto. There's no distinguishing qualities or characteristics to this location. Now, what did I mean by this route has been forgotten by Game Freak? You see, this route and others has data built into the game to tell you what Pokemon you will find in the wild. And what I mean by that is that wild Pokemon are actually sometimes determined by the weather status. For example, you may find one Pokemon when it's sunny and another when it's rainy. The problem here is that Route 7 has all this data. It has actual numbers, mass percentages around when you will see certain Pokemon in different weather conditions. The only thing is, this route is always clear, meaning the rest of this data is unused and therefore forgotten by the actual creators of the game. There are 3 trainers on this route, and only one of them has kind of something significant about them. You see, Gentleman Caden has 3 Pokemon, but one very important one, and that is Poltergeist. And if you didn't know, the Pokemon Poltergeist has a 1% chance of having an authenticity mark inside of its pot, and this makes 1 out of 100 Poltergeists out there genuinely authentic. You're probably wondering what all this means, and to be honest, for the casual player, it doesn't really mean much. But guess what? Caden's Poltergeist is authentic, meaning it does have this unique stamp or sticker inside of it. But if you didn't know about this secret and you weren't planning on catching 100 of these things, you would probably never know it existed in the first place. And even if you did battle Gentleman Caden, what is the odds that you would then go into your Pokedex, go to Poltergeist, and then look up its backside, I guess. This is one of the weird cases in Sword and Shield where there's data in the game that really most players would miss if it weren't for the internet. And even the theme of this route is unforgettable. It's literally just a spliced version of one of the wild themes in the game. It doesn't even have unique music, making it even more unremarkable. Now, the next route, I will admit, is probably the most interesting on the list. Unlike the other entries on this list, there's plenty going on in this route and plenty to talk about, but that doesn't stop it being forgettable. The problem with this route is a clear lack of purpose, and that route being Route 18 in Unova, featured in Black and White and also their sequel games. There is technically a lot to do here, but one could argue a lot of that is completely pointless. You'll find this route directly west of your starting town, New Vema. It's also connected to Route 17. You'll need Surf just to access this route, and you only have access to Surf once you've beaten and collected your 6th gym and 6th gym badge. But at this point, and that part of the game, you've probably completely forgotten by now that there's even that body of water there in the first place next to your starting house. This means most players that discover Routine will probably most likely find it after they're forced to go to their house after beating the game and the main credits roll. This means most players will only find this route post post-game. But anyway, once you do finally decide to surf west of your starting town, you'll probably be met by a lot of disappointment. Fun fact about this route is that it's one of only 4 in the entire main series library of Pokemon games that doesn't act as a link between 2 different towns, but instead it's actually just leading to a dead end. It just reminds me of when you play an open world game and decide to venture out all the way to the game's border and edge, just to be a little disappointed that the developers didn't put anything really of interest there. Also, navigating this route can be kind of frustrating. It's not like a typical route, but more acts similarly to a cave in Pokemon. And yeah, Route 18 technically does have a lot going for it. It is filled with trainers, battles, and items, but the items aren't that interesting, the battles are pretty boring, and the wild Pokemon in Black and White you've definitely seen a whole bunch of already before you visited this route. The whole experience of Route 18 just feels difficult, pointless, and a bit empty. Well, kind of, because there is one special trainer on this route in Black and White. They will actually give you an egg that contains the Pokemon Larvesta. The problem here is that Larvesta evolves into the Pokemon Volcarona that can also be found in the Relic Ruins, and exploring those ruins and coming across Volcarona as a static encounter feels way more interesting and special than just being handed its pre-evolution in an egg by a random NPC on a route you've probably never wanted to go to in the first place. What's even weirder though is that in Pokemon Black and White 2, you'll actually find the Magma Stone that can be used to get the legendary Pokemon Heatran. The only 2 problems is that number 1, you don't find Heatran on Route 18, you find it in Reversal Mountain, and number 2, how many of you remembered this is where you find the Magma Rock? It just seems completely random and out of place. So yeah, Route 18 may not be completely empty, but in my opinion it's definitely way more forgettable than any other route in this region. And for the final route on this list, it's actually one I sort of hinted towards before, and it's located in a region we've looked in, Galar. This route is actually the very reason I wanted to make this video to begin with. It's really that forgettable. I'm even willing to bet that most of you have either completely forgotten about this route, but never even knew it existed in the first place. Even if you've been here before. You've probably been on this route, but for less than 10 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen and everything in between, I would like to introduce you to Route 9. Tunnel. This is the part where I would probably break the route down and talk about its individual qualities, good and bad, but I think it'll be a lot more easier to just show you the entire Bulbapedia page dedicated to this route. It's pretty empty, and you could say it's as abrupt as the end of this video. Goodbye. Oh, but one more thing. If you're interested in watching more Pokemon content, don't worry, I got you covered. You can click here to see where I talk about who is the richest NPC in the entire world of Pokemon, and to be honest, I think the answer will surprise you. Thanks for watching.